Welcome to Bring It Home. I'm Craig Fuller here with John Paul Hempstead, my co-host. Each week, we sit down and talk about America reindustrialization. This is the one podcast that focuses and celebrates all of the industrial developments taking place across the American economy. We dive into topics that people are really interested in, whether it's new announcements of new manufacturing expansion, new policy discussions, strategic discussions about what it will take to win the industrial race, or just general topics about what is on the mind of companies thinking about American reindustrialization. We are celebrating this topic here at Bring It Home because it is an important part of the economy, an important part, frankly, of America's success is to be, once again, the leader in global manufacturing. So JP, what are the big headlines that's driving the industrial?
We've got a bunch of semiconductor announcements actually recently. The U.S. Department of Commerce finalized a $6.1 billion award to Micron Technology. They're building factory projects in New York and Idaho. And I mean, this is massive. You know, $6 billion is a huge number. That might be the largest investment that we've covered other than like Blue Oval and maybe...
I've got a bigger one.
Maybe XAI, okay.
I've got a big one. Did you see the SoftBank announcement?
No.
Where Donald Trump, they were in Mar-a-Lago.
Yes,
and
okay,
the
yes.
founder of SoftBank
I saw it.
Came out and announced the $100 billion investment by SoftBank in the United States.
My confidence level to the economy of the United States has tremendously increased with his victory. So because of that, I'm now excited to commit this $100 billion and 100,000 jobs.
Now, it wasn't tied to manufacturing specifically, but it was tied to business investment of $100 billion.
And Donald Trump had he did a classic art of the deal move where right at the moment of the announcement, he's like, you know, Masa-san, that's great news. We're so grateful for this $100 billion investment. Can you make it $200 billion?
Trump said, Masa, you know, double that is not enough. Maybe, you know, go for more, right?
That's what I'm going to ask him right now. Would you make it $200 billion instead of that? He can actually, believe it or not, he can actually afford to do that. Would you do that?
Very Donald Trump asked,
and he was like,
never
I'll
declare
try,
victory.
I'll try.
Never declare victory until you make the final point. It's sort of the old classic art of the deal where you blow up the deal, put more pressure at the closing table.
Yeah.
So, because people are in the mood to get those done. Big semiconductor investment, which I think, you know, we're going to have our guest on today to talk about industrial policy, industrialization. She is a public policy advocate, a nonpartisan organization that actually talks about reindustrialization. But she highlights a number of the industries that are actually focused on reindustrialization. And really, one of those is semiconductors and the importance that America wins the semiconductor race. Just another one of these continuing.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, semiconductors, you know, people think it's like, okay, like building, like, it's not just about like building personal computers, for example. Like if we remember back to the global chip shortage during the pandemic, it affected everything from, you know, kitchen appliances to automotive manufacturing, everything that is, has technology in it.
I mean, so many things have technology. I mean, even toys. You buy these toys where, you know, there is so many.
There's a silicon wafer in it.
Yeah, I think so many products have these today. And, you know, our economy, our modern economy, semiconductors are a part of that.
It's almost like the iron or like the rubber of, you know, the economy 100 years ago, right?
Yeah,
It's almost like something, a horizontally distributed component that goes across so many different verticals.
And the Japanese went to war over rubber.
Yeah.
And so
And petroleum,
like it is one of the things that, the modern economy, particularly with so much advancement happening, everything that is manufactured, semiconductors are either part of the driving the process in the industrial machinery for those manufactured products, or end up in the product itself. And semiconductors are core and parts.
And then, of course, with AI driving
Even much
demand, and Micron talked about just massively, expanding demand for all of their AI-related chips in their last earnings call. Anyway, they expect this investment and with some other, sort of capital projects that they have to create 20,000 jobs in the United States over the next 10 years.
Amazing.
So, I mean, they're a huge company.
That is 20,000
20,000
jobs, a lot of
semiconductor jobs.
It is interesting. One of the things that I think is absolutely certain that will happen is Donald Trump loves to take victories. And a lot of CEOs love to bring Donald Trump victories.
Yep.
And whether or not they end up delivering on their promises, a lot of these investments are made up over 5 or even 10 years. Whether we're talking the number of employees or the big size of these deals, I think we'll see a lot more of these announcements simply because they're such great, they get big press, they bring a lot of attention to it. And I think it frankly creates a lot of favor with government, particularly Trump's administration, when you're making big announcements.
I do. I think he's showing the business community how to play the game, kind of showing them, like not necessarily the rules, but the expectations, how to get favorable coverage, press, things like that. Even how to, we talked about, he tweeted, that he's going to accelerate like capital projects in excess of $1 billion and expedite the regulations and things like that. So I think he's we could see sort of this cascade of companies and capital flocking toward the United States as they realize that
particularly foreign manufacturers and businesses here. And we saw this during the first Trump administration, is that there was a desire of foreign manufacturers to demonstrate their commitment to the US economy and America by actually opening up or building production plants here or expanding. Not at the level we're seeing it now, but I think, if I'm a CEO of a foreign company, I'm certainly thinking I don't want to get locked out of America's markets. And the best way to avoid that is to make a big announcement, put a big capital plan in place for investment, and make sure that the administration knows about it.
And it's so interesting as like a paradigm of foreign relations as well. Like some people might say like, oh, this is like, crass and transactional, like these other countries are just throwing dollars in and expecting to like get preferential treatment. But it's like, but what was the alternative? Like they would just sign a piece of paper or issue some like vague
they need a
thing.
catalyst. I mean,
they would say like, oh, we have shared values, therefore we're your allies or something like that.
I think the way that it used to operate, where you did your thing and you sort of quietly moved your cost offshore, and you found new producers, and you sort of supply chain was sort of ignored. It was kind of like, except for the people impacted by those job losses or the plant shutting down or the suppliers having to reconfigure their supply chain, particularly parts in that dependency paradigm. Now we're in a situation where supply chains are front and center, and global trade is front and center as a bullseye, not just in the United States, but globally. And I think because of that, there's so much requirement you have to play the game. You can love it or hate it. It's just the way the game's played. And it means that making big announcements, particularly if you're really wanting to get favor with the US government, in the Trump administration, being able to give them some victory in jobs and investment goes a long way.
It's fascinating that we live in a time where like supply chain like location decisions have like political and public relations like dimensions to them now.
But they should.
Yeah.
They
Of course,
absolutely
of
should.
course.
And it's the same, if you go back to the Cold War, it's the same reason at the height of the Cold War that we had military bases, that were the largest employer in many of these small towns.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just for national defense. Actually, it wasn't for national defense. It was predominantly for political, it was
Like patronage,
congressional congressmen would go to the constituents and say, I'm
Right.
going to bring this, Army fulfillment center, or this Air Force base, or this Army base to my community as a way of creating, some
The
political
new
momentum.
jet wing or engine will be built in my
Yeah,
district or whatever.
that's why the F-35 is one of the most expensive aircraft ever made. It's also the reason the F-22, which is actually argued to be better than the F-35 as an aircraft, was economically infeasible because it had required multiple component providers all over the country. It's also what Airbus...
It's supposed to make them unkillable politically, but yeah.
Well, yeah, but it also makes it incredibly expensive because now I've got this supply chain where I have this tiny little parts vendor, it's the only vendor that can do this, and some really remote part of Montana that I have to contend with.
But in the congressman's on the appropriations committee.
But that's how it works.
Yeah.
And I think you even saw that, you could even go back during the Cold War and see that with companies like Airbus, where you had British and French and, German companies coming together to create a commercial airliner that could rival Boeing. It's sort of a sense of European pride.
And this is what the guy from Boom Supersonic was saying about what's different this time is that it's not just a national prestige project where it's like being heavily subsidized by the government, but it's more of like a hand-in-hand partnership with the private sector where they are looking for commercial outcomes. They're looking for, to source their production closer to the end consumer, et cetera. So it's not simply like building a military base and writing everyone in the town a check. It's
Correct.
building
Military
real things to
bases
real economy.
themselves don't actually create economic growth,
Right.
because you're just taking dollars from one essentially government. I guess it does create
Now, if
economic
it's surplus
growth.
spending, it does.
It creates economic growth, but it doesn't create the kinds of growth that actually drive the sort of expansion of the economy at large, because it's effectively taking tax dollars,
Right.
or printed dollars,
Transferring them, yeah.
and transfer them over to arguably a military base is an unproductive asset. Hopefully, it's always unproductive. Hopefully, you don't need them, but it's not actually delivering growth into sort of a sector.
It's not the machines on the base aren't doing productive work.
Hopefully, never. I mean, hopefully they're there for their purpose, which is to make sure that if they're ever needed,
Yeah.
that they're there. But its primary purpose is exactly that: is to be a deterrent, but also provide economic. But I do think you point out an interesting concept, which is the policy, the industrial policy that we have with whether it's semiconductors or whatnot, is moving it towards the capitalism, towards corporations to drive a lot of the development, not the government sort of defense sector driving it.
Another word on foreign companies being encouraged to invest in the U.S. Global Wafers, which is another Taiwanese silicon chip maker, was awarded $406 million to support two fabrication facilities, one in Sherman, Texas, and one in St. Peters, Missouri. And then Bosch, which everyone sort of knows is like a tier one auto parts supplier, but obviously heavily involved in all different parts of that supply chain. They got $225 million to support their total of $1.9 billion investment in production of silicon carbide power semiconductors in California. That investment, the $1.9 billion, is expected to create about 1,000 construction jobs and then about 700 manufacturing, engineering, and R&D jobs in the state of California.
California.
Those were all announced in the past week.
California being a remarkable story because it's not known as a destination. It has not been a huge winner of a lot of the industrial investments that have been made in the last decade.
Too expensive to make stuff there.
Too expensive. The regulatory body, the regime of trying to get things approved, it's a really difficult place to do business for a lot of businesses, and a lot of people don't want to take it on. It's interesting that
That's good news for them, and maybe semiconductor manufacturing is economic there, even there with the high costs.
Yeah, for sure. You need engineers. A lot of the semiconductor manufacturing is not just about the raw material. A lot of it is about having access to engineering talent. And California is arguably unrivaled in terms of having the engineering talent to actually understands how to build these things. And
Silicon coming back to Silicon Valley.
yeah, which is great because a lot of Silicon Valley has been about
Atoms, not just
creating
bits.
software,
Yeah.
which is mostly a game of mathematics more so than anything. JP, really a lot to talk about here. We have Rosemary, our guest, that's going to dive into a conversation about industrial policy and what she sees around companies consider reindustrialization. Really excited to have her here.
Yeah, it's Rosemary Coates is our guest with the Reshoring Institute. It's been around since 2014, so she's been working on this for a decade, seeing a lot of recent momentum. We were just talking before the show. Rosemary, are you here?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Good morning.
Hey, good morning, Rosemary. Lots of conversation about reshoring. Reindustrialization has become, in vogue. Tell us a little bit about the evolution of what you've seen from reindustrialization over the last, decade or so.
Yeah, well, a little bit of history. I worked on outsourcing to China for about 15 years. I had I've been a management consultant for 30 years and had a lot of clients that were very interested in moving to China in particular in the early 2000s, the late 1990s. And so I became pretty good at it and did that for a long time. So I helped a lot of companies offshore with sourcing or manufacturing in China and became a sort of an expert at it. And I wrote a book about sourcing and manufacturing in China that became a bestseller. So everybody wanted to do it. Basically because there was an understanding that it would be cheaper in terms of labor and also operational costs. Then in 2012, during the Barack Obama and Mitt Romney presidential race, remember those days? It wasn't quite so crazy back then, but at any rate, they were both China bashing and saying, China is stealing our jobs and they're manipulating currency and on and on and on. And I'm like, oh man, holy cow, I can't tell anybody what I do for a living. This is bad. And so I think it actually though sparked an initiation of conversations with a lot of executives regarding the potential for bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. So I started having these conversations, and eventually we developed a methodology for how to evaluate potentially bringing manufacturing back. And we started the Reshoring Institute as a result of that. We initially incubated under the University of San Diego. I'm on the board there, and so I flew to San Diego. I live in Silicon Valley, but I flew to San Diego and asked them if they would house our Reshoring Institute, and they did, and we incubated there for 3 years. Today, we're affiliated with 18 universities all across the country. We take interns and provide research and consulting services from there. So now, after the pandemic, the reshoring really took off. And I think that's because most companies um, recognized how much risk there is in these long global supply chains. And we're really interested in de-risking those supply chains and trying to figure out how to be in a steady state of production going forward. Industrial policy, though, is a whole nother chapter, I guess. We have no industrial policy that's written in the United States. We've been basing our approach on markets and the market economy. But I think after the pandemic, it became pretty clear we do need to have some kind of industrial policy in the U.S.
So it sounds like the momentum, as you've talked about, this was 2012, like you said, a very different time in the election cycle, very different kind of decorum, even relatively peaceful. The candidates were, shades of red, if you will, or shades of blue, either one.
Purple.
But just the
They're both
shades of the same
purple.
color. But now it's so polarized. But I think one thing that both parties agree on is that China is an enemy and is a threat to the United States in a number of ways. And that is prompting companies to reconsider. But you mentioned something quite interesting, which is during the pandemic, it sort of woke up corporate executives to realize the risks of sourcing and keeping sourcing in China. Was this really driven by Chinese policy, or is it driven by supply chain disruptions and freight movement and those types of issues?
Well, I think it's important to understand that it's very broad what's happened. So I wouldn't characterize China as being an enemy per se. I think they're a challenger in terms of getting ahead in terms of technology and their industrial base and so forth. But the world has globalized. I mean, we can't just turn a spigot and say, we're not going to do this anymore. We don't have the economic profile or the structure to bring back all the manufacturing. So, for example, we don't want the 23-cent an hour t shirt production back in the US, because if we bring back those low paying jobs or, minimum wage jobs like that, it doesn't pay a living wage. And as a result, we have to supplement with welfare. That is not what we want to do. All right. So, what we want to have come back is the more sophisticated kind of manufacturing that requires higher skills with the workers and a higher pay point, and drives the economy in a reasonable way in terms of rebuilding the middle class. So I think the economics around it are quite complicated, and I think it's the right approach to think of China as potentially a place where low cost goods might be made in the future, and for us to compete on a much higher level in terms of things like AI. So the sophistication there is important, and we don't want to fight so much and put the world at war. We want to figure out a pathway where we can continue in America, continue to drive leadership and take the reins in terms of industrialization, but not fighting everybody along the way.
Rosemary, what kind of industries do you think makes sense for the United States to compete on? Where are those? What are those industries that we're well positioned and we should be encouraging reshoring?
Yeah. So after the pandemic, there was a study done under the first few days of the Biden administration, but there was a study done that identified the top 100 or so supply chain vulnerabilities that we have in the US and what commodities they are. And the top four out of that list, the priorities became semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, EV batteries, and rare earth elements. And those are the industries that I think are absolutely essential and probably would head us to the preparation of industrial policy. Semiconductors, of course, are already coming back. We are building like crazy. We have semiconductor plants being built in Arizona, in Idaho, in New Mexico, Texas, Ohio, New York, all over the place. These are big multi-billion dollar investments to rebuild and extend the manufacturing of semiconductors in the US to get us out of that vulnerable situation that we have where we're sourcing almost everything out of TSMC in Taiwan. And that's because the geopolitical situation, China threatens Taiwan. And I guess I should say when, not if, when China takes over Taiwan, if they assume the reins of TSMC and start making all these semiconductors, we're in bad shape. So we need to rebuild semiconductors in the US, and we are doing that now. So that's a very good step forward. Pharmaceuticals, most of the building blocks in the pharmaceutical industry that are related to the development of specific drugs. So the kind of the basic building blocks made in either China or India. And so we're starting to see pharmaceuticals being brought back and some of that manufacturing coming back to the US. That's also another vulnerability. I mean, if we don't have the pharmaceutical base to make biotics, for example, that's going to be a problem, right? So we need to develop that here and keep it here. And I believe it should be part of our industrial policy. EV batteries, there's no question there's growth in that area, and it's also in parallel with sustainability initiatives. So the development of batteries back in the U.S. And manufacturing here, finding ways to become more efficient, is also important. And then finally, rare earth elements. You can find rare earths everywhere. In your backyard, there are rare earth elements. But they're in big caches and certain places, especially in the western U.S. There are big mines that can produce rare earth elements. It's the refining of those elements that has become an issue. So most of the refinement is happening in China, up along the Mongolian border in the middle of nowhere, because the refining requires or pollutes the environment a lot. And so China now controls about 85% of the rare earth elements. Now, these elements are all used in electronics. So, in order to produce wiring and circuit boards and so forth, you need these rare earth elements as well as industrial magnets. And there's no way around that. We're very vulnerable in that regard. If China decides to turn off the shipments of rare earths to the U.S., we are dead in the water. This is really important. So we used to refine rare earths here. We had a refinery in one in Nevada and one in California, and they were shut down in the 70s because of pollution. So what we need to do is reopen those refineries and figure out ways to not pollute the environment with that refining, and or developing substitute products. There's a company, for example, up in I think in Minnesota, called Niron, that has developed an industrial magnet made out of iron, which is available in the U.S. So that's a good substitute product for other magnets that were coming from China and developed through with rare earth elements. So there's a lot of movement. There are certainly top priorities. We need to pay attention to where we're vulnerable, identify that, and then go after rebuilding those industries in the U.S.
Rosemary, that's fascinating. I completely agree with you about those three kind of core strategic industries where it kind of makes sense for the government.
There's four.
Four, yeah. Sorry, including the rare earth metals, right?
Yeah.
Right. So we've got, what was it, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, EVs, and rare earth metals.
Yeah. Right.
But beyond those like kind of strategic ones that the government may want to kind of, put their thumb on the scale and encourage reshoring in those industries. I was interested by something you said kind of in your opening bit, where you were talking about like the really clear-cut case in the 90s and the early 2000s for offshoring that involved lower labor costs, lower operational costs. And then you said, nowadays, when you're consulting with companies and helping them figure out the math on bringing production back to the United States, they're often concerned with eliminating risk. And you said there's a kind of an interesting methodology that you guys have developed to sort of put that into economic terms. And I'm wondering, I'm asking you to drill down further into how should companies think about supply chain risk? How do you price or put a value on supply chain risk? And how does that compare to the other metrics that they're optimizing for in their operations?
Yeah, so I think you need to think of it like this. So when you have a long global supply chain, there are a lot of handoffs in the supply chain. So you have a manufacturer in China, for example, that may hand off to a logistics company that hands off to the steamship company. The steamship company carries the goods across the ocean, and there are ports and stevedores and warehouses and customs clearance and delivery and all that. So every single time there's a change of hands in the global supply chain, you introduce a point of risk. So there may be, an incorrect handoff, documentation, delays, all kinds of things. So shortening that supply chain, I think, is the primary driving factor. And that means that producing in proximity to where you're manufacturing or where your customer base is a very important driving concept, not only for de-risking your supply chain, but also for sustainability. I mean, we've been dealing with global warming here, especially in the past few years with hurricanes and floods and fires. And I live in California, so we're concerned about fires every fall. We're just on fire watch all the time. So, these kind of things, by shortening your supply chain, you address a smaller, or you have a smaller global footprint, carbon footprint. And you help to build location manufacturing near the location where you're selling to your customer base or where you're doing final production. So that's a really important aspect. I think in the early 90s, when I was working with executives, all they really cared about was cost. And so we'd look for low cost labor and low cost operations, both. Today, if you look at China, and we did a study 2 years ago now, but we did a study of global labor rates. And so we looked at 10 categories of jobs in 12 countries, and we compared the labor rates across the board. And it's clear that now China is sort of middle of the pack in terms of labor rates. So it's no longer a low cost country from the perspective of labor. It's sort of right in the middle. The low cost countries now are Vietnam, India, and Mexico. And Mexico, surprisingly, has some of the lowest labor rates in the world, especially in central Mexico. So, looking at labor rates and costs, the cost structure is really interesting. The risk that's been identified in every point in your supply chain, the potential to address sustainability issues that seem to be on all executives' agenda. Sustainability has a high profile these days. So these are the kind of things that go into that decision making. I think it's kind of old fashioned to look at it to say it's just total cost of ownership. That's kind of the starting point where you would look at all the costs involved in your supply chain. But after that, you need to look at the geopolitical risk. You need to pay attention to, as I said, green energy and sustainability issues, reducing your carbon footprint. And in the US, I would top it off by saying most people favor products that are made here. We did another study a couple of years ago about Americans' preference for made in the USA, and something like 82% of the people we interviewed, and we interviewed 500 people all across the country, all education levels, uh, uh, all sections of the US, and they told us that about 82% they preferred to buy products that were made in the USA. So if you put that on top of the other issues, that's really helpful in driving the return of manufacturing here. And these people told us they'd be willing to pay more for products that are made in the USA. So up between 10 and 20% more for products that are made here. And partly that's due to the perception. I don't know whether it's true or not, probably not true, but the perception that products that are made in the USA are better quality. And that's without any testing or anything else. It's just opinion. It's just the way Americans feel. So that, these kind of things are driving rethinking your globalization. Uh, the other point I would say is that most companies are not necessarily ripping everything out of China and bringing it back to the US. I think there's a more refined approach by executives now. It used to be they just were concerned about money, just the cost. Now they're more concerned about de-risking and more world view. So we see a lot of companies that are doing a China plus one strategy. So leaving some production in Asia, because that's a growth area, and also considering opening operations in one or two other countries. So maybe China plus Mexico, China plus the US, China plus the US and Vietnam, something like that, to de risk your supply chain by making it distributed across the world.
So, Rosemary, a lot of conversation about the reasons to reshore. This has been played out not only during the Obama 2012 election, but also Donald Trump, I think, brought it to every American. It became the topic, if you will, and not just a topic that was among topics. It was the topic and has remained the topic, if you will, for the last 10 years. Where do you sort of look at this from a sort of a prioritization element? Is this a national security? When companies are exploring this, are they thinking supply chain resiliency, potential of national security issues? Is it cost? Is it labor? Like, how are they thinking about when they choose a site and they're choosing about bringing production back? What is the evaluation criteria that they're using?
Yeah, so we have a criteria approach also that's part of our methodology where we look at 30 points. Usually there's somewhere around 30 different aspects of where to locate. So, certainly cost is kind of the basic element. But you have to start when you're talking about cost, you have to start with a comparison of how much labor is involved in your product. So let me give you an example. If you are making men's shirts, for example, and you have a sewing shop in China or Indonesia or Bangladesh that's making men's shirts, that has a big sewing component to it, a very large labor content. So probably more than 50% of the cost of what you're producing is labor. If you look at labor comparisons around the world, the US is, 10 times more expensive than Bangladesh. I mean, there's just no way you can justify a major sewing kind of re, profile in the US if you're making sort of low cost goods that you'd be selling in Target or Kohl's or somewhere like that. So you have to look at where in the world you could manufacture and make use of that low cost labor. And it's probably not the US because it's just too much labor content, it's too expensive here. On the other hand, if you have a product, let's say textiles, that actually makes the fabric for those shirts, the textile production is fully automated. You go to a textile plant, you walk around there aren't any people. There's a few engineers maybe adjusting the equipment, but there's no people there. And that's because it's fully automated. So when you don't have a high labor content like in the production of textiles, you have lots of options. The US is certainly ripe for bringing that kind of more high technology production back. And we see a lot of growth in textile production in the Carolinas, for example. So you have to look at your product. The basic is the cost. What's the cost of labor in your product, and then make a decision about where you might want to locate because of that. Now, it doesn't have to be China. It could be a lot of other places if you have a lot of labor content. As I mentioned, Mexico is a kind of ideal because of the proximity with the U.S. And then after that, you build on that these other potential decision points. So I'll give you another example. I worked with a company that made water filtration equipment for over a year. I worked with them to find a location in the U.S. And one of their criteria, well, they had two criteria that were super important and guided the decision. One was they were looking for a location that was close to a university that was doing water research, biochemical research. That was really important because they had advanced research going on in their product, their water filtration product. And the other was they needed to be near an international airport because they had lots of international travelers. The company was headquartered in the UK. So we ended up picking a location near Dallas, the Dallas Fort Worth Airport, with lots of international ability, as well as a fairly low cost and welcoming environment for this production. So that would be another point, is looking at what's the profile of the company, how do you determine where they might be best suited to locate. That's another of the 30 criteria that we would look at.
So, Rosemary, you mentioned environmental earlier on, that environmental issues, particularly when it looks at refining of rare earth metals, is a challenge. We actually had someone talk about mining on a prior episode, and he pointed out that rare earth metals are not rare, which I thought was interesting as he unpacked the fact that they're more ubiquitous. Yeah. They're just called that, sort of some misaligned marketing. Yeah. But one of the things that has been talked about, you mentioned it, is the environmental issues. And one of the things I hear constantly from folks that are in industrial supply chains is that what we have not only done is export our manufacturing, but we've also export our environmental problems around the world, particularly in places like China. How does a company that may have issues with the types of refining they're doing, or sort of dealing with American environmental regulation, a lot of it, while well-intended, goes much further than the mission. And you get in this bureaucracy malaise that just takes years and delays and cost without actually accomplishing anything. How does a company get comfortable with taking on those risks or those issues?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point too. I think we have in many cases overstepped our good intentions and boundaries on environmental issues. I believe in Mother Earth, and I think that we need to take steps um, to avoid polluting further and contributing to what's happening with climate change. However, I also recognize that a lot of the environmental issues and regulations have overstepped where they should be, and that causes an economic hardship for a lot of manufacturing companies. And so, we stunt the growth in manufacturing unless we have reasonable environmental laws and regulations. So I think there's some pullback that needs to happen. I know Trump has talked about this also, sort of releasing some of those regulations, not so that we're polluting all our water and everything, but so that they aren't quite as restrictive and allow for going forward for manufacturing. And I think that's a reasonable approach.
Yeah,
So that's
one of his
one thing. And then I think tax credits are another. There's right now we're at 21% tax on manufacturers, and the world average for tax on manufacturers. So in France and Poland and everywhere around the world, the average tax rate is 24%. So we're actually below the world average taxing our manufacturers. And I know Trump wants to bring that down to 15%.
My plan calls for expanded R&D tax credits, 100% bonus depreciation, expensing for new manufacturing investments, and a reduction in the corporate tax rate from 21% to 15%, solely for companies that make their product in America.
So hopefully that will be incentive enough to rethink your investment in manufacturing in the U.S. and drive some more manufacturing back. I hope so. I think the original reduction didn't drive so much back, but maybe this time it will.
Rosemary, you're specifically talking about corporate taxes when you say industrial tax, manufacturing tax. Obviously, there's a much broader set of constituents that are impacted by it. One thing that Donald Trump has talked about, which is really interesting, is that if someone does $1 billion investment in the United States, that they would receive expedited approvals of those, whether it's building a data center or bringing technology or actually manufacturing. $1 billion is a way to get through those expedited approvals, because I think that's the biggest issue. And even on the residential side, I've got a friend in town that was building a neighborhood along the river. Took 4 years for TVA to approve his project.
Crazy.
Riverton, which is just right here.
Insane.
And the project cost jumped from 18 to $50 million because he originally scoped it before COVID, and then after COVID, or during the early days of COVID to after to where we're at today. And the cost jumped by 4x. I had the own experience in it in a real estate investment. And the problem wasn't that there were environmental issues necessarily. It was the approval process. That took so long. And I think that's the tax that no one can predict is if I wanted to build a plant, I want to make those decisions quickly because businesses are all focused on making decisions quickly to get the returns. And I'm not going to get bogged down and put a lot of resources. And this is think of a failure of capitalism or a feature or bug of capitalism, particularly Western in the United States capitalism, is where corporate executives are held accountable on quarterly earnings. It's great. Like, that's the way it works. The problem is it's hard for them to think 3 to 5 years down the road, especially when you have delays just to get construction started that are going to happen on a big project.
It was really cool to see what I think, what I hope to be almost like a prototype of these fast track billion-dollar projects in the U.S. When Notre Dame Cathedral opened in Paris, they rebuilt this 800-year-old cathedral in 5 years. And the way they did it was the French National Assembly actually passed a special law waiving and massively accelerating all of these like environmental and regulatory and labor sort of approvals that they had to do. They passed a special law so they could get it done and Macron could like fulfill his promise. But it seemed to me that that's exactly
what you have to
do.
Yeah. And I think that's the, whether getting $1 billion, $1 billion, that limits the scope of how many projects could happen. I think if they're successful, then hopefully we'll see a lower threshold required, but still, $1 billion projects, I don't know, Rosemary, the number of $1 billion projects that are brought in the United States, probably measured in a couple dozen per year. But that's still getting those through the approval process is important.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, the bureaucracy stunts that growth for sure. And not just in the US. If you were trying to build something in India, for example, the bureaucracy make you tear your hair out. I mean, it's really awful. So yes, speeding up that process, I think, is quite important, paving the way for all companies, not just billion-dollar companies, but a lot of the reshoring is happening in the mid-range companies that are, say, $5 billion in revenue or less. That's where you see a lot of the growth and rethinking their supply chains. So, clearing a path for the speedy approval process is really important. I mean, and we have a model for that. Look at China. Man, they decide they're going to build a 8-lane super highway. They decide that this month, and construction starts in 3 months.
And you see these videos of these people in China and Japan. I've seen them as well, where it's like they take a camera and they disassemble a bridge or build an 8-lane highway, and they do it in like 24 hours. You're like, we're going to lose the war if we're having to fight these people because
and that the point is when you build that fast, you have approval and you build that fast, it helps fuel your industries across the board. It makes it really fast. So that's something that we can learn from. And if we speed that approval and permitting process in the US, we're going to see faster growth as a result.
Rosemary, before we go, I actually have a question about the political environment. We've been kind of dancing around it a little bit. We've obviously talked a lot about some of the incoming President Donald Trump's ideas, but you actually went back to a moment in the 2012 debates when both Barack Obama and Mitt Romney were kind of woke to our new relationship with China. Is the imperative of reshoring and the importance of reindustrialization, is there a kind of an emerging bipartisan consensus on that in Washington these days? Or is it mostly one party, or is it just kind of a scattered group of people? How is this sort of the mentality there forming around reindustrialization and reshoring?
I think reindustrialization is very bipartisan, very bipartisan. Everyone wants to bring manufacturing to their location, and there's a very good reason for that, and that's because manufacturing has a magnifier effect on the local economy. So when you put people to work in a manufacturing environment that pays a living wage or greater, those people who work there are going to spend in the local economy. So they're going to shop at the grocery store, they buy gas, they have their hair done, they have their nails done, they go to the barber, they spend money in the local economy, and that fuels the local economy. So it has a magnifier effect that's very significant, the highest among all industries. It's somewhere between 4 and 10%. I've seen numbers all over the board, all over the board. So four times you're spending $1 in a manufacturing environment has a 4 times effect essentially on the local economy. So that's really important, and our legislators know that and are interested in bringing manufacturing to their local economy for that reason. But the kind of manufacturing is also important. As I said at the beginning, what we want is high tech manufacturing, more advanced skills, advanced technology, advanced machine tools, 3D printing, robotics, all these kind of things that make us very efficient in manufacturing, but they aren't so low level that they create a welfare state where we have to supplement people's income. We want the higher level. We want the better skilled workers. We want the more automation. And so, our focus going forward should be on industrial policy that's more sophisticated overall.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating conversation, JP. Just everything about industrialization. Rosemary, really appreciate your time. You highlighted a number of challenges that exist in the issues that our government needs to address, whether it's expedited approvals, providing the right level of taxation and incentives to bring manufacturing back, but also the playbook, I think, on how to actually execute this. Interesting enough, and I think this has not been stated a ton, is the opportunities in Mexico, particularly as you move inland. Rosemary commented on this. They have the benefit of low labor costs, particularly inland, because we have an immigration challenge in the United States on our southern border. Mexico has it on its southern border as well.
Right.
And that's feeding in a lot, that's fueling a lot of the lower cost wages in Mexico. And it's to our benefit for our partner and our neighbor in the South to actually have those factories here. American consumers benefit from it.
Yeah, so just a couple of comments on Mexico. We're getting a lot of interest in with our clients in developing manufacturing in Mexico. So Mexico has a new president, Claudia Sheinbaum. She is an environmental engineer by training and very interested in developing new industrial parks throughout Mexico. So we're going to see a growth in manufacturing. Also, if you put Mexicans to work in their local area, they're not going to try to immigrate into the US. They'll have jobs and good paying jobs and so forth. So that solves part of the immigration issue. I think immigration gets all the press, but the industrial development is probably a bigger story. The growth along the US Mexico border in terms of automotive and in terms of value and scale of stuff that's coming across the border now is important to look at. It's an important story on the scale of making Mexico the new China. So if we are able to address some of the immigration issues and continue to support um, manufacturing and growth in Mexico, I think that's good for both countries. It's sort of our southern low cost manufacturing state, if you will, and it can be quite helpful to our own economy.
Yeah, it's interesting. Post Cold War, post World War II, a lot of that opportunity of low cost manufacturing was in the South. Mm-hmm. That's why the South and the Midwest was
Correct.
industrialized it. that went away when we started globalizing the economy. But the South has come back in force, still being a destination for manufacturing, newer type of manufacturing, but also a large amount of commercialization that's taking place and a population shift. So it's really important. Rosemary, one last point before you go, because you touched on something that we've pointed out here on numerous occasions, which is so much of the conversation is about, particularly in freight markets, is the idea that if I'm creating tariffs on products and then effectively I'm lowering the amount of transportation because I'm impacting the goods consumption in America. That's one argument. The other argument is that I think is less discussed is that manufacturing domestically creates a lot of intermediate miles than those sources because you're moving in raw materials, you're moving in components to be manufactured. If we are actually just importing products from China, and that manufacturing process is taken entirely offshore, we are not benefiting. Our economy is not benefiting from the assembly of those products, nor is the raw materials being consumed and the transportation that is associated with that. And I think that's an area that economists have just completely missed, particularly when they're talking about transportation markets.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, we see over the past 20 years or 25 years, as companies went overseas to China, so did all their suppliers. So the whole supply chain moved. So now, if a company's going to come back to the US, they need to redevelop that supply chain in the US. So there are, as you mentioned, component manufacturers, parts makers, all kinds of the development of a final product to take place in the US. So if that all comes back, then we are likely to see a boon in transportation for sure. And so, that's a good idea too. All of this has to come back. We usually tell our clients it'll take you 18 months to redevelop your supply chain in the US because as all those suppliers went overseas, you lost all the skills and the know-how and so forth. And all of that needs to be redeveloped. So, I think I'm very optimistic. I think we have a bright future in reindustrialization in the US, bringing up the percentage of workers in the US that work in manufacturing. Right now, it's about 12%. So I'd like to see that at about 20%, so that there's more and more manufacturing, more people put to work here, and a stronger and better economy for all Americans.
Rosemary, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time here today. Have you back, give us some updates on what you're seeing in the market, as well as what you're hearing from clients. Really appreciate the conversation. JP, Rosemary is just a source of information, an enormous amount. It's interesting, the conversation that she's had about the four horsemen, if you will, of the reindustrialization: electric vehicles, pharmaceuticals, rare earth minerals,
and semiconductors.
We have talked about all of those.
Yeah.
And the big
like
industrial announcements that we have made have been those conversations.
Yep.
And so it seems like we are, at least as a country, making progress.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually great to hear that just the headlines that we're noticing organically in the press and the projects that we're hearing announced and the investments that are closed match the priorities that, the sort of the national strategic priorities that were identified in that process that Rosemary was talking about. That's actually like reassuring somewhat.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it means that this story is a lot to follow, and just a continued level of victories and wins that we're seeing in the reindustrialization and bringing it home.
For sure.
Really appreciate you joining us here on Bring It Home. Be sure to download the Bring It Home podcast series on your favorite podcast player. Sign up for the newsletter at bringithome.us. This is a conversation where we talk about American reindustrialization and why America's century is still ahead